Hey, how are you? Fucked. I'm dead. I just couldn't go today. Yeah, today was one of the worst days on my bike.
Oh, sorry. Before we make this, man. You're a champion. You're a champion. Enjoy it. Thank you. Enjoy it. I honestly couldn't be more proud to play a part in that because it's actually a role that I haven't done before, and I took so much pleasure out of kind of reversing roles, and I really loved it today.
Welcome back to the Unchained Binge podcast, everybody. I'm Kaylee Fretz. We're here for episode 6, Domination. Kit, welcome back to the show.
Hello.
And joining us for the first time in this series, Ronan McLaughlin. Welcome back, Ronan.
Thank you. Got a squeaky chair with me too, so it's another first for the series. Oh, it's not?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, it's not first, I'm afraid.
This is the squeaky chair club. Oh God, hopefully that doesn't show up in the actual microphones.
I will sit perfectly still.
Kit, episode 6, Domination. I mean, basically, this is the bike race episode. This is like when we actually hear about Tadej Pogačar and Jonas Vingegaard. But what else goes down in this episode?
Well, yeah, I mean, in episode 6, the race for the yellow jersey reaches essentially its climactic turning point in the stage 16 individual time trial and the Queen stage that followed the day after. So will the invincible Vingegaard hold on to yellow, or does the plucky Pogačar overcome his rival at last? We also revisit AG2R, whose double act Felix Goll and Ben O'Connor are back to fight for stage victory against the odds.
There wasn't actually much racing done, given how dominant Vingegaard was over those 2 stages.
Ooh,
I mean, it was alarming to look back at it. I mean, obviously we all witnessed it at the time, but seeing it once again was, I think, the standout for me from that episode.
It was a good reminder of just how shocking that day was. Both the time trial day. I would actually say that the Col de Loz day was actually less shocking maybe for us because riders crack, right? Like that's a thing that happens versus the time trial where they both had good days. They were both way ahead of everybody else, right? Like they were both way ahead of Wout van Aert in third, and they were so dominant, and Vingegaard was so dominant over Pogačar. It was one of the wildest days at the Tour de France I think I've ever personally experienced, and on year 14 now.
We did though have the Netflix effect on the Col de Loz stage where it showed Vingegaard catching notable climbers. I'm pretty sure it also exaggerated how long he was stuck behind those cars.
Oh yeah.
Netflix did a great job of hyping up that Vingegaard's performance on the Loz.
The same can be said for the time trial, which, once Pogačar had finished, the narration said, no, he doesn't know if he's won the stage in the yellow jersey yet. He's got to wait for Vingegaard to finish, as if we didn't know that by the time checks that Vingegaard was already way ahead.
And was crossed the finish line 20 seconds behind him.
Yeah.
Or 30 seconds or whatever it was. Yeah. And anyway, before we get too deep into this episode, as always, we're going to start with sort of the characters, right? Who are the characters that we, if not meet, then maybe learn more about in this episode. And the big one is obviously Pogačar and Vingegaard, who they've popped up in earlier episodes, obviously, right? Like they're in throughout, but we certainly get a lot more with both of them. We get a lot more insight into Pogačar's kind of like mindset around all of this and some of just his attempts to deal with what had just happened to him and all the rest. We get Urska in sort of helping with that particular storyline. We also get, on the UAE side, we get Gianetti and Machin, the two, like the sort of general manager, head sports director over at UAE. We'll talk about them a little bit. We get more Richard Pluga, the head honcho over at Visma Lease Bike, who plays Darth Vader particularly well, I think, in this episode. We get a bit of the sort of the voices of the tour, which I think is interesting for anybody who watches a lot of the tour, and particularly if you're at the tour, you hear these voices a lot. So we got Emma Crossan and Nicholas Roach, who are obviously doing commentary for the folks at home on television, and then Seb PK, who is basically his whole job. I think you picked this up from the show. His whole job is to sit in a car, watch the race from a car, and talk over the radio in both French and English and tell everyone what's happening.
Yep.
Official race radio. He's become very much a voice of the tour. He's included in both series now.
I don't think it's clear from watching the show, though, that what he says on the radio goes to all of the following team cars. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of how the support cars for the riders who are racing the race keep track of what's actually happening in the race. They get that live feedback from Seb PK And the characters like Christian Ehrman, who we're seeing as director for Jumbo, they may well have a TV screen in the car, but that TV screen is usually 30 seconds behind. And so what Seb Piquet says over the radio is usually their best way of keeping track of what's happening.
Yeah, there was a great moment in an earlier episode when I think it was on the Puy de Dôme stage when Ben O'Connor was. Oh no, it can't have been. Anyway, Ben O'Connor was in a breakaway, and Vincent Lavenu was sitting in the car seat, the driver's seat, and he hears O'Connor from Piquet, and he winces. But then the rest of the sentence is O'Connor has attacked Group 2 and is heading up the road to join the breakaway. So it's the updates that he's hearing, and I mean it's a kind of quite sad moment in a way. If you're Ben O'Connor, Lavenu says, "Oh, I thought he was going to say he's dropped." He hears O'Connor's name, but of course it was actually that O'Connor was getting into the breakaway. It was the Pello Bilbao stage 10 victory, or whatever stage it was.
So Piquet, Macross, and Roach, they kind of serve narrative functions, right? They're kind of providing a bit of context. They are, it was not scripted, but they understood the assignment. We'll get to the awards later in the show. But the three individuals that I think are worth kind of diving into a bit further before we get into the rest of the episode are essentially the three kind of team principal types, right? So Mauro Gianetti, Machin, and Pluga, right? So we have the sort of, the guys running UAE and Visma, the guys running the two biggest teams in the race.
We've also got Neerman. He's a very big voice in this episode, Grisha Neerman.
Yeah, but we've met him previously.
Yes,
We've talked a fair amount about Neerman already, whereas we get a lot more of these three, right? Yeah. Let's start with Richard Pluga. So he's the general manager, team principal at Visma Lease Bike. He's the guy who was sort of masterminded turning this team into the biggest, best team in the world. The team that won all 3 Grand Tours last year, the team that has won basically everything there is to win. He doesn't come across as particularly amicable, nice.
I'm not sure he does the team many favors in the interviews he gives, or in the interviews that were selected for the show.
Well, because one of the major themes in this episode is essentially doping accusations, right? And his sort of response to that is, I think, the response that we hear over and over and over again. He knows his values, blah, 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 blah. But they've definitely, Netflix has kind of intentionally painted him as a pretty negative figure. You guys agree with that?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And then on the other side, so here's an interesting thing. On the other side, we've got Mauro Gianetti and Machin Fernandez, who these guys...
I know where you're going now.
Okay. These two... The two guys that run UAE, who are not painted as bad guys in this, ran a team at varying points called Sonia Duval and a couple other things from about 2004 to 2011 or 12 was the last year. In that time, I think it was an 8-year span, they had 6 riders test positive in that time, most for oxygen vector drugs like EPO. They had another rider who was stripped of a Vuelta a España win for doping. The whole team folded in 2011, largely because of all the doping that had been associated with it, right? Now, this is in the bad era of cycling. It was very much, the sort of end of the EPO era. This is the systemic era, right before the biological passport was implemented, right before the sport sort of started to shift quite dramatically culturally. But these two guys ran what is known to be kind of the dirtiest team, or at least the most caught team of that era, right? Like Piepoli and all these guys. There's so many guys busted for EPO.
I mean, you could go back further to Gianetti's own career himself when he was a bike racer before even Sonia Duval.
Yes, although so he in management, right? He has priors,
yes,
right? So interesting to me that Netflix paints Richard Pluga, who let's be clear, there's never been any ties to that team and doping offenses, and Pluga does not have that in his particular history. There are directors and things involved in that team that obviously have a history. This is pro cycling; it's pretty much everywhere. But he's painted as the bad guy, which works, I think, quite well for the show's narrative. And then on the other side, the guys running UAE, which is very much painted in a positive light, right? The sort of plucky hero, Pogacar, the sort of childish, almost figure, right? The guys running that team were, past tense, it's important to use the correct tenses here, were connected with a team that is noted as one of the dirtiest in the sport's history. I found that interesting, and I think it's worth it's worth bringing up, right? So we have avoided a lot of the doping talk up until now, but the show doesn't avoid it in this episode. And so I think now is the time for us to provide a little bit more context here. Now, it is also worth noting that most teams in pro cycling have individuals like this involved. I was just recently reading a book about the 1998 Tour de France, the Festina affair, by Alistair Frothingham, and Rolf Aldag, who is also featured in other episodes of this show. He's a sports director at Bora Hansgrohe. There's stories in that book about him flushing his EPO down the toilet in Dublin because Willy Vogt has just been caught on the Belgian-French border and the Festina affair has just kicked off. So my point being that, like, just because teams have these folks still involved, just because these individuals are still in the sport, is not necessarily an immediate, like, that team is still dirty, right? And I think that is a dangerous thing to do. But in the context of the show, and you're painting teams and managers as good and bad guys, I found it quite interesting that the two guys which historically have been bad guys previously are on the side that is painted in a much more positive light.
It's also just on a very surface level. If you remember last year, obviously UAE weren't involved, but that provided quite a convenient position for Pogacar. He was the villain, the unseen other person to Vingegaard. And Vingegaard was painted as this kind of, I don't know, the boy wonder, wasn't he? The great scene of him sitting on his Jumbo-Visma duvet set, cross-legged, and giving an interview that way. And so it's a turning of the tables in that sense, just in the Netflix catalog, in a sense. So it's,
I think Plugge doesn't do himself any favors away. Like his answers to the questions, I know it can be chopped up and you can apply the Netflix effects and all that, but he does come across as rather sort of brash and arrogant, I think is fair to say.
Oh, for sure.
And that just presumably just makes it easier for them to convey him in that way. I've never spoken to the man, so I can't confirm nor deny if that's how he is, but
that's how he is. Okay. No.
Whereas Giannetti is very, very, well, shall we say, media trained, and I have spoke to him, and I kind of got the impression.
Speaks French. Yeah, he speaks French in the show, right? So, like, rather than getting subtitled, again, this show is made by Netflix France, and the large target audience is French people, and so I think, like, even little things like that, like Giannetti he probably knew what he was doing there. He could have spoken. He speaks perfect English. Obviously speaks like Italian. He could have spoken his native language. Could have spoken English. Spoke French instead.
Speaks
as
incredibly softly.
He does speak incredibly softly. I've always kind of assumed it's because he's trying to make it so we can't hear what he's saying in our little microphones when we have to go back and try to quote him later. Anyway. So those are the characters that we are introduced to. I do think that the history of some of the folks running UAE is relevant. However, I am also not saying that the current team is doping because of that history. Because I think if you did that, you'd have to do it with almost every team in professional cycling. And that, frankly, is not something that we're going to be harping on or dealing with like regularly.
The flip side of that is because a team doesn't have a history, it doesn't mean they're clean also. They work both ways.
Yeah, 100%, right? So anyway, but it's worth mentioning. It is context, it is sporting, it's the history of the sport, and it certainly, I think, was particularly interesting given the way that these two were portrayed. So the episode centers on basically two stages, right? We've got the Col de la Loze stage, we've got the time trial stage. What do we learn here? Because this episode was it was the most bike racing of the episodes, right? Like, when I think back to our experience of the Tour de France last year, this episode is like, that is the crux of it, right? Like these are the big moments. This is what we're talking about. We're talking about Pogacar and Vingegaard every single day on the Tour Daily podcast, on the website, etc. And finally, episode 6, we get essentially that storyline.
The thing that immediately jumped out of me, and relating to the time trial stage, a lot of the talk around that time, and I had done an article myself on escapecollective.com, digging into the sort of the time trial and how the performance that we then went on to see, just how that happened. And following that, a couple of months later, we actually did a podcast with Matthew Hybor, who we see in this episode. Also, he does speak, but he's not introduced, so I'm not trying to explain who he is. But he's the head of performance at Jumbo-Visma, and there was so much talk at that time, from ourselves included, around the different marginal gains and optimization that Jumbo had done that could go some way to explaining the performance that we've seen. What we didn't hear at the time, and what we weren't aware of at all, was anything along the same lines happening at Team UAE Emirates. And the sort of perception was that it was mostly Italian intuition, let's say, that was applied to whether or not a bike change would be faster over the entire course of the time trial, or if staying on a time trial bike would be faster. And we certainly didn't hear about any testing that the team had done or anything. But I was immediately sort of intrigued by Mauro Gianetti. He mentioned the testing that UAE had done prior to the time trial. Didn't really explain whether that was on the morning of the time trial or if it was months in advance, if I remember correctly, but it gave the impression that it was done months in advance. And the other thing was Tadej Pogačar himself said that changing from the time trial bike to the road bike would have been 40 seconds faster for him, which, if I remember correctly at the time, is just not possible.
It's not true.
So I'm kind of wondering, is that just like an off-the-cuff remark, or is that what they genuinely believed? And does that give us a bit more insight that we didn't have at that time?
Yeah, because basically there was big questions around, like, so this, let's focus on the time trial first. First of all, I have an admission to make, which is that Netflix made time trials look cool. I would like to state for the record that this is not true. This is the Netflix effect.
No, it is not. Netflix merely conveyed what happened on the day entirely accurately. And like the scenes that we've seen from the bus now were not from different days. Those were all entirely accurate representations of time trial day.
I guess for anybody who's listening to this podcast that doesn't listen to the rest of our podcast and doesn't know Ronan and myself as well, Ronan loves time trials, does a whole podcast called Performance Process about optimization and going faster, right? And I am bored to tears generally by them. But anyway, my admission is that Netflix made this time trial look really cool, right? Like even the helmets and all the kit, right? Like they made it look cool, which was, I think, impressive. Anyway, let's focus in on this time trial. So the big narrative out of the backside of it, in both the show and in real life, was how on earth did that just happen, right? Because again, to sort of put this in context, if you plot the times of the entire peloton, it's sort of like a nice upward curving arc of points, right? Most of the riders fit on this sort of same trajectory. Some are faster, some are slower, but they're in the same trajectory. And then these two, Pogačar and Vingegaard, are just off on their own, right? Hence that L'Equipe headline that was referenced in the episode, on another planet. Extraterrestrial, which has a fair amount of history in cycling as well. They mentioned this in the show, but like that was a term that was used for Lance Armstrong by the French media back in the day. So these two were just like way out, totally separate from everybody else. If you plot their time trial times, they were on another level. And then Vingegaard was on another level from Pogačar, right? Like we've kind of gotten used to those two being on another level, but the fact that those two levels were then once again split was the thing that made everybody go, what the hell was that?
Can I give my idiot's rationale and then we can hand over to Ronan for the considered and expert answer? Because so the way that I mean, I will admit that I did not watch this stage live last year. I was at home at this point and I took a day to myself because I wasn't working that day and it was a time trial. So I can see the numbers at the end. I remember logging on to my computer and seeing Slack just awash with comments, a lot of them from Ronan, at just kind of the awe at what had happened. But anyway, I mean, so from where I'm sitting now, knowing what happened next, the way that I make sense of it in part is we know what happened the day after. Pogačar went pop. So maybe he was beginning to do that the day before. But then of course you've got to factor in Wout van Aert is a bloody good time trialist as well. And he was, his time was fairly well dashed by Pogačar.
There was a big hill in the end of the time trial.
Exactly. Yeah. And also it was stage 16. So the number of people actually bothering to race was smaller than it might have been on stage 1. So there are all those sort of circumstances that you can throw in to try and find some rationale for it. I'm reminded of Remco Evenepoel's time trial win at the Giro last year when he subsequently tested positive for COVID. So he was so much better than everybody else that he was able to still win, not by as much as Pogačar was better than Wout van Aert. But, there are these instances where, if Pogačar wasn't already on a downward slope, which, I don't know that he was, but the following day he lost a lot of time. If he was already in a downward slope, then he might have been closer to Vingegaard had he been on a better day. Now that's how my head without all the knowledge that Ronan has. That's how I rationalise that without being suspicious. Ronan, can you tell me how stupid I am?
No, I cannot, because you are not. I mean, I could give you the answers that I published last year in an article, and the things like the recon that Jumbo had done and the pace notes that they gave him over the radio to help him go faster in the corners, and the time differences that were clearly conveyed by, I think, SBS at the time, Australian television, who had like timed Vingegaard and Pogacar into and through and out of corners, and the time gaps that he was taking freewheeling, which, if we're talking about doping here, doping does not help you when you're freewheeling. Well, it might. You might be fresher mentally, so you can better take corners. But let's just say that Vingegaard was taking time where it was just preparation work and bike handling and everything else that Jumbo had done to prepare for that stage that was making the difference. There was no actual power through the pedals. There was other things we could talk about, like for Jumbo, the question of do we do a time trial to road bike change was never really a question, because months beforehand they'd gone to sort of, I don't want to say extreme lengths because it's fairly basic stuff. They took the paint off their time trial frames, and they had a lighter time trial bike to start with, and they used different wheels, and I think they cut the seat post, and there was things they had done.
So to stop you real quick, so what would be the reason to do a bike change for those who, because they didn't really explain this in the show. So Pogacar made the decision to make a bike change from a time trial bike to a road bike. Ben O'Connor kind of briefly explained it, I think, in like one line. But what is the real reason for it?
Well, the reason is that the stage finished at the top of a climb, the Col to the Lows, which it was called a call. It's a
it's not. Was it? It was a Domination.
No, not the Lows.
Yes, sorry. Called the.
I think it was Domination or something.
Domination.
Côte de Domination, yeah. And as an uphill on a time trial bike, first of all, time trial bikes are heavier, and then they're less conducive, let's say, to climbing in the position you would typically put yourself on a bike while climbing. Road bikes are just much more comfortable and much more efficient for producing power going uphill, because you're in a more upright position. You can better generate power. When you're going uphill, you're going slower, so aerodynamics are less important. So there is a crossover point, a debated crossover point, at which the aerodynamic benefits of a heavier, more extreme position time trial bike are no longer outweighing the benefits of being on a lighter road bike, in which you can sit more upright and produce more power. And the question going into that time trial was, do you change bikes? Jumbo-Visma and Vingegaard decided not to change bikes. Months beforehand, Pogacar's decision seemed to have been made on that day, and Pogacar had decided to make a bike change. Now, the part of the equation was that there was a climb to the finish, but there was a false flat for the final kilometre or two, if I remember correctly, at which point the time trial bike would again definitely be faster. And then throw into the mix also the fact that to change bikes, you actually have to stop. And so you will lose time just by stopping. The mechanic has to get out of the car, take a bike off the roof, give it to you. You have to get going again. You have to get your rhythm again. You have to get used to a bike that feels entirely different. So it's not easy changing bikes. If it's a proper mountain.
They can't be waiting with a bike.
They
it has to come from the car.
And they can only push for so long. And if I remember correctly, it has to be done within a certain zone and stuff. That it's not a straightforward question. It's not a straightforward answer, but it's, in this instance, I think it's been pretty much proven at this point that time trial bike to the finish would have been the faster solution. And that's what Visma had done. I think more importantly for me, though, what I was going to say was, it was the fact that Visma had made that decision months in advance. And they had, I can't answer whether doping was involved or not, but what I can answer was that they were just better prepared for that stage.
And that comes across in the episode too. I think the confidence that Jumbo-Visma had before that stage compared to UAE. I mean, we'd already seen Pogacar seeming vulnerable and unsure of where he was in the race and where he was in his form. And in his team car, they were very determined to get the TV production to be in the right place where they wanted him to be, so that he was out of Pogacar's way. And then in the Visma car, Vingegaard had been very relaxed, and Neerman was just commenting on Wout van Aert's time and how GC rided. It was just incredibly relaxed. They were obviously confident, whereas UAE were starting to look a bit desperate.
I mean, you could debate why they were so confident, but
true. Yeah.
I think,
but having been prepared several months before speaks to that.
I think you also have to consider that Jumbo-Visma, as it was then, lost a Tour de France 3 years earlier on a penultimate day time trial, which featured a much longer climb to the finish, but did feature a flat start on time trial bikes with a change to road bikes to complete a final climb up a much bigger mountain. And Roglic looked nailed on to win that Tour de France for Jumbo-Visma, which would have been their first Tour win. And Pogačar, of all people, came from nowhere and took victory in that Tour with a dominant display on the final climb of a time trial in which he had changed time trial bikes. So you can see Pogačar probably would have been confident in his preparation given that history, and you can see why Visma also would have just been like, we are never going to let that happen to us again, and we're going to go to whatever lengths required to do so. But to answer your actual question, Kit, can I give you the actual answers? I was reminded last night that I don't think it matters if, like, and I've asked Jumbo-Visma for their power files. They said no. But I don't think it matters what we would see. Would it be power files? Would it be CDA measurements? Would it be... I don't think it would matter if I was allowed to live with Jonas Vingegaard for the 6 months prior to the Tour and follow him everywhere for 6 months, and then published a video with my new camera drone of everything he did for 6 months. It wouldn't be enough for some people. And that's, you know, the when you see those time gaps and you know the history of the sport, unfortunately, even for ourselves, I think your mind naturally starts to question, is this real? And no matter what answer we provide, either it's Netflix or Jumbo coming on podcasts or whatever, the question will just remain, I think.
Do we think Netflix handled it well?
I think I was interested to see the inclusion of, I mean, there was quite a bit of behind the scenes and how the race works in this episode, but I was quite interested to see the inclusion of the the on-site doping control. So they were giving as much of the story as they could. What they didn't do quite so well is that the people they chose to ask about whether Jumbo-Visma should be under suspicion, they only asked all the most predictably grumpy team bosses and sport directors, and then the only person who could back up Vingegaard was Wout van Aert, who was a friend and teammate of him. So that's where it sort of fell down a little bit, but otherwise I think that they dealt with it pretty well, especially as the story then goes on to seeing Pogačar capitulate the day after. I
thought it was relatively even-handed considering the history, and this isn't meant in any sort of disparaging way, but like the history the French media have with doping, particular doping from non-French riders. and keeping in mind that this is a French production, right? I think that it would have been easy to tilt into the realm of conspiracy, like lots of people did in the aftermath of that time trial. I think it was relatively even-handed, right? Like they certainly gave Visma or Jumbo, I'm going to mess the name up forever now, Jumbo the opportunity to sort of respond. We got a brief bit from Vingegaard. We got a brief bit from Plugge. We've got the Wout van Aert bit. We even get like a 2-second line from Sepp Kuss in there in the hallway. They had a sort of opportunity to respond in that way. And yeah, I think it was treated relatively well. I think that what they couldn't get into, which is what Ronan got into in his story shortly after, was then like, what is the explanation then, right? Like, or if not the explanation, what do we know went into it? We only can know what we know, right? So what do we know went into it? And what we know went into it was this incredible level of preparation.
You get a comedy answer. You get a comedy answer from Grisha Neiman saying, if I told you, I'd have to kill you.
Right. Yes. Right. But it's like, Ronan's right. It's like, it's basic stuff, right? It's there are riders doing their local 10 in the UK who are putting as much time and energy and thought into their positions and their equipment and everything else as Vingegaard did in this Tour de France. So yeah, it's not anything particularly exceptional, and it does come off the back of like remember the helmet Roglic was wearing on the stage that he lost, the stage 20 to Pogačar, right? Like helmets all sideways. We heard that they had just recently gotten it, right? So it was like a late inclusion. They would never do that. No. They learned from that experience, and they would never do that again. And I think that we can talk about what we know.
I mean, it's important also to say that I'll give one example. Like that time trial that we've seen in this episode, Jumbo-Visma had a tent for the riders to warm up in, and that tent was like a cool zone or a chill tent, where they had fans blowing cool mist to keep the riders cool during the warm-up, because it's been identified in recent years that if you get too warm in your warm-up, you start to overheat quicker in the time trial and your performance declines pretty rapidly. And while all the teams know that at the moment, it's a perfect example of how one team will identify something, they'll make an advantage of it, and then all the other teams will follow suit. And it's also the perfect example of how Jumbo just took that to the next level for this time trial, in that I can't remember which team did the proper pre-cooling strategies for like wearing ice vests and all that. It was probably Team Sky before a time trial of a Tour de France that they won. But what we've seen here with Jumbo was they took the pre-cooling to the next level, to another planet, if you want to use that headline. And they had their riders, how much of a difference it makes, we don't know, but they had their riders, cooled much, much better before the start, which presumably would have helped their performance some small bit. And I thought it was just a perfect example of how all the teams are doing the best they can these days, and they're spending considerable budget on optimizing all these things. But there are still some teams that are leading the way, and some teams, most of the teams, that are following. I don't know, but I think if you're following, you're always going to be behind. It's in the description of that word.
Kind of by definition.
Yeah. By definition, that's the word. That's the phrase I'm looking for.
Let's get into the cold to the low stage. Let's get past the time trial here. We've got enough on that. Again,
never enough.
We're not here to speculate on stuff that we can't know. And I thought that Netflix treated it relatively well. If you want to read that story, actually, people should go check it out. Just Google
the debrief analyzing that tour time trial. If I just Googled a minute ago, if you Google the debrief analyzing that tour time trial Escape Collective, you will find it.
Go check it out.
And we have a podcast following that also with Matthew Hybor. That was very, very interesting.
Let's get into the cold to the low stage. So this is the end of Tadej Pogacar's run at the Yellow Jersey, right? He had this horrible collapse. Cold to the lows they paint it as one of the hardest climbs anywhere in the Tour de France, which I think is accurate. It turns into basically a bike path over the top, gradients over 20%, 24%, I think. Horrible climb, and a horrible climb to have a bad day on. There was a fair amount of sort of like clever editing in this one. I think it roughly told the story of the day, but obviously, I mean, that they're trying to compress a couple hours of racing into a couple minutes, so that's kind of always going to happen. But the big sort of result of it was, and the sort of narrative piece of this was, that it really solidified that Pogacar is the good guy in this, right? The lovable loser in this one, which is just a really weird thing for him to be because he wins everything. But Jonas Vingegaard is then, this is the new Death Star, right? Like, we always referred to the Team Sky bus back in the day as the Death Star, and Jumbo-Visma is the Death Star in last year's Tour de France. They're all a bit sort of dark. They're just portrayed darkly. And I think that really kind of came home in this episode and in the lows bit, because you get this emotional human reaction to what happened to Pogacar on that day.
Today, how are you?
Fucked. I'm dead. I just couldn't go today. Yeah, today was one of the worst days on my bike.
Yeah, it was a very memorable moment on the and like you say, I remember on the day it happened, it was kind of this inexorable. I don't know. The climb lasts forever, and the moment that Pogacar disintegrates, obviously that was like a big explosion. But then it was this kind of constant: how much time is he losing? How much further can Vingegaard get? Will he catch the last of the breakaway? Will he kind of crush everyone by winning the stage as well? It was this kind of it almost had this soundtrack playing in the subconscious, just of the kind of the drama of the moment. It was and then in this you do just see, I mean, you see the famous moment that Pogacar muttered into his radio that he was done.
Yeah,
it was a huge it was a huge moment in the Tour, and it wasn't just a physical collapse; it was a mental collapse too.
Well, he there's a quote from him in there basically saying that the two are one and the same sometimes, right? Yeah. And one of the lines that stood out to me was he asked his teammates, I think he asked Rafa Majka at the top, like, am I still on the podium?
Yeah.
Right? He was worried that he fell off the podium. And just for context there, he came into that stage with 6 minutes on third place, right? So he was worried that he had lost 6 minutes to Adam Yates on that stage. That's how bad he felt, how slow he felt he was going. He did end up obviously holding on to the podium relatively easily. He retained about a 3-minute advantage, I think. But yeah, that's how bad it was for him. And I think the show was pretty effective in painting
the drama
sort
of the whole
mental and human anguish around that kind of collapse. We see these collapses all the time in the sport. You see a rider go until they cannot go anymore, and then we rarely get the kind of real reaction to that. It's hard to get in real time. I can't even count how many times that's happened to a rider. They've had a terrible day. You go and you try to talk to them at the bus afterward, and they just say no, right? Because they don't want to talk to you. In the same way that early on in the show, we saw Ben O'Connor refusing to talk to anybody, right? Talk to journalists. But that's the one advantage that Netflix has here is they can kind of force it. They can also come in later and, talk to them a week later when they've had some time to digest it and ask them how that felt. So I thought it was a really unique perspective. It was something we don't usually get.
At the top, even before the moment when he asked if he's lost the podium, the first thing he said to Adam Yates when he rolled up was, "I'm sorry," because he'd been chewing himself up mentally and feeling like he'd let his team down. And Adam Yates was in third place. His teammate was, and he said, I can't remember if did they show it in the show. He told Adam through the radio to go and fight for podium. So he told Adam just to go and race for himself, where otherwise he might have tried to drag Pogačar up the mountain. So
was it Soler that stuck with him? Who stuck with him?
Yeah, it was Soler who was with him to the end. Yeah, and it's not something that Pogačar we fondly refer to as the meme lord of the peloton. He's this kind of happy-go-lucky guy usually, and we've just seen him at the Giro absolutely dominate and stay cheerful, obviously the way through, and he cracks jokes, and he's one of the much more charismatic characters from the peloton. And this was a rare moment of vulnerability that we rarely see. And obviously, a lot of viewers for Unchained aren't going to be aware of that, but I think that was really striking and well done by Netflix to carry that story through.
I don't know how much we can link or separate the two, but it's also one of the first times we've ever, well, not ever, but it's one of the only times we've seen Pogačar in such bad condition at a finish line. And it was actually 2 days in a row when you think about it. He didn't look his usual. Usually he puts a minute and a half into Wout van Aert in a time trial. He looks pretty happy at the finish line, and not just happy, but actually fresh and in control of the effort. Whereas in both these days, it looked like it was just, and I think there was a big mental factor at play on the second day on Col de la Loze. It was the win is gone. He's there fighting for a win. Doesn't need another second place. He was second the year previously. The will to fight in that moment, it's just not going to be the same for him. But still in all, he looked, finishing drenched in sweat, jersey fully open, sort of draped over the bike the entire way up the climb. That's not the Pogačar that we recognize.
For those out there not super familiar with bike racing, what could cause that? What do we like? There's a bunch of different answers
2 months
to that question. Well, that right.
Because that is important though, because he did suffer. We've seen it earlier in the series. He suffered a broken wrist in Liège, Bastogne-Liège, and we're 2-3 months later at this point, but that will have interrupted his build up to the Tour de France. Did it make enough difference to be the 7, 8, 9 minutes, whatever it was, to Vingegaard in the end? Who knows? But it certainly did not help him. And then if he came into the Tour undercooked, undertrained, let's say, or underprepared, it's sort of a snowball effect then, where every single stage is just sort of fatiguing him a tiny bit more than it is for Vingegaard. He's still head and shoulders above the rest of the peloton, but eventually, is that what we've seen transpire then in the time trial, and then the following day add in the sort of the psychological impact of the time trial? I do think a lot of it stems from that interrupted period where he was running up and down steps in Monaco with a backpack rather than being out on his bike training like a Tour de France contender should be.
Yeah. We were actually just talking about this in the regular weekly episode about the likely scenario for Vingegaard. I think this year is that because he obviously came back from a much worse crash at the Basque Country, similar timing. He's probably, his 20-minute power is probably about where it needs to be. The question is his 20-minute power where it needs to be week 2.5? And that is a much more difficult thing it takes much longer to get to that point than it does just to get the sort of the snap back, right? One more, I guess, sort of brief return to the narratives that have coursed through the whole series here. We get Ben O'Connor redemption in this, which I thought it was quite interesting because he is not portrayed particularly well in those first episodes, but he he comes across in this one exceptionally well.
Oh, sorry before we make it, Ben. You're a champion. You're a champion. Enjoy it. Thank you. Enjoy it. I honestly couldn't be more proud to play a part in that, because it's actually a role that I haven't done before, and I took so much pleasure out of kind of reversing roles, and I really, really loved it today. So I'm so happy that Felix has won today.
Right? Like he put himself on the line for his teammate to great success. Felix Gall wins this stage to Col de la Loze. I'm thankful that they spent so much time on O'Connor earlier, because I think otherwise that Felix Gall stage win was great, right? And it's the kind of stage win that Netflix probably would have ignored if they didn't already have the O'Connor narrative, right? Because Netflix ignores most of the stages in the tour, right? Like we only see a handful of stages from the entire race, and we only really get to know and care about a handful of riders out of the, 180, 200? What's the total these days? 21 teams. So I was glad that they had that narrative arc that they could sort of tie a little bow on that. And I think we got a positive view of O'Connor at the end, which is great. And
the return of Gall, the never-endingly polite young Austrian who has no confidence in himself.
Yeah. He's like Austrian Carlos Rodriguez, right? I think they come across really similarly, and I think they're probably both a bit more brutal. Well, you don't like that, Ronan? They're both just quiet. They're quiet guys in the interviews, and then
you can be quiet in different ways, though.
They're killers on a bike.
No,
right?
You can be quiet and be quiet. You can be quiet and be just a person that's too nice for their own good, and you can be a quiet person who's just quiet because they're not nice.
Interesting.
And I'm not saying that applies to either of those, but I have never seen a similarity in Carlos Rodriguez and Felix Gall.
I'm saying how they're portrayed in the show, not saying in real life. Yeah, to be very clear.
It's probably also worth mentioning that I had to skip forward a couple of episodes to be ready for this episode today, so I haven't seen how Rodriguez is portrayed, actually.
He's just portrayed as a very quiet, very quiet.
He's the opposite to Pidcock, yeah.
Exactly.
One other thing I think it's important to mention is just the whole, I can't remember who brought it up, but the mention of the 2,000 kilometers that preceded the time trial, and there only being 10 seconds between the two riders. And then in the 22 kilometers of the time trial, there was a minute and, what was it again?
38.
38. And the suggestion that is...
Yeah, that's...
Yeah, I mean, it is insane. It's not something we see all that often, if ever. But it's also it's used as a point to shock, to add shock to what happened. Really. It's
not unusual in pro cycling. It's not there's a reason why
they're riding solo versus riding on each other's wheels and responding to each other and
recovery,
everything else we've just discussed.
There's no drafting.
No. No
time trial's the race of truth. It's just mano a mano, right? And then the rest of the race is you've got all these other dynamics that are happening, and the dynamics are generally working in favor of keeping riders together, right? Like drafting keeps riders together. Yeah, it was.
You also just don't. If you're Vingegaard and you're that much stronger than Pogačar throughout the entire race, you don't actually know you're that much stronger, and so you never make a maximal effort for fear of being counterattacked. If Pogačar is actually just as good as you or better,
and especially as Pogačar is explosive, he does explosive acceleration, so he is going to get on your wheel if you attack. But you might not stay there, and you don't know that.
That was one of the first moments that actually both riders would have been going full gas and a true reflection of their potential on that day. And so perhaps it should have been actually spun the other way. It was like, wow, Pogačar kept it within 10 seconds for 2000k.
Yeah.
But
any other Easter eggs from this one? Little things that we noticed. The commentary boxes was interesting.
Mm-hmm. A lot of the behind the scenes stuff, which I found interesting insight. And we've seen into the French commentary box before, I think, but we got a lot of Ant McCrossan and Nico Roach, including a bit of exposition. I can't imagine they really do that kind of morning briefing. It's like, you've had time to think about it now, Nico. What do you think?
Maybe an award for later. Yeah.
I noticed the former Jumbo Visma team bike, a Bianchi, outside the window when Vingegaard was getting a So Jumbo were riding Cervelos that year, obviously. A couple of years prior, they were riding Bianchis, but obviously one of the staff members or something likes to go for an evening ride, and they had a Bianchi along
That's
with
amazing.
them. And it was just outside the window as Vingegaard was getting a massage. On the massage, also, can I just clarify, having listened to a couple of these episodes of the Unchained Binge over the weekend, to have just a towel covering your entire body for a massage that's normal. And I think Johnny had suggested that the towel might not even be there if the cameras weren't. The towel is always there. But it's just,
the towel is sacred.
Let's say the rider's underwear would have been on until they got to the massage table, and then it would be replaced in a discreet way with a towel, so that the Mr. or the Soigneur can do the massage without covering the rider's briefs and massage oil and having the awkwardness of constantly touching his underwear. Kelly's looking up there thinking, where is this guy going with this?
There's a spider. There's a spider crawling up I noticed the time trial suit fitting. I thought that was kind of interesting. Yep. So Santini, I guess the context here is Santini provides, which is a clothing company, provides the leaders' jerseys, including the time trial suits, right? Different company from the company that provides like UAE or Jumbo Visma's suits, right? So normally for a time trial, riders would have a suit sort of like custom tailored. They've tested a whole bunch of them. They know which one is fastest. Clothing is exceptionally important for these sort of marginal gains, for decreasing drag as much as possible. One of the sort of downsides of being in the lead is that you have to use a suit that hasn't had as much, that isn't as sort of like closely tailored for you, right? And so Santini is obviously doing the best they can with sort of like on the spot tailoring, trying to make those suits as fast as they can possibly make them. But like kind of like helmets, different suits can be faster on different people, and there's a whole lot of testing that would normally go into that. So it's a marginal gain kind of left behind but you have to, because that's the company that sponsors the leaders jersey.
The good thing from that time trial is that both Vingegaard and Pogačar had the yellow jersey, Pogačar had the white jersey, and so they both had, let's say,
the marginal losses,
potentially suboptimal. We don't know. It could actually have been better than the suit they had. We just.
I was going to say maybe that's why they were so much better than everybody. Maybe everybody needs to be in Santini next year.
Yeah. The other thing I thought was interesting was just the UAE support car staff losing their minds over the following the TV camera bike. And given that the UCI changed the rules last year that support vehicles cannot be within 25 meters, I mean, if that motorbike is anywhere in front of Pogačar, it's going to help him with the draft in some way. And if it's behind him, there is also potentially a marginal gain. So if there was any chance the TV bikes would have been behind Pogačar closer than the team car, I'd have been saying, have at it, guys. Please do not move. We want Pogačar's rear end recorded for this entire time trial. Get your motorbike as close as possible behind him.
Because a vehicle can actually sort of push air in front of it and make the rider go faster, right?
It fills
that
pressure zone behind the rider and just makes it can be faster.
It's all very complicated. Let's get into our awards before we wrap up today. The Golden Razzies. Who's our Golden Razzie?
I think there's only one contender. And it's maybe a double act, but I think there's only one contender, and it's Ant McCrossan. And I don't think it's his fault, really. I think Netflix kind of dropped him in the mud and said, mate, you're going to have to introduce his stage. We want you to provide us with some bluster, a little bit of, I don't know, stir the pot, and a bit of exposition mixed in with it. And it just didn't. It did not feel natural at all.
Does anybody know if Steve Chanel and the shouting is natural? Does he shout all the time, or is it just for Unchained?
Well, that's an interesting question. And so this was something that was discussed on our Discord channel, our Unchained podcast channel, because somebody had made that comment, and then one of our French, or at least French domiciled listeners, members, came back with that and said, yeah, it's ridiculous. He's portrayed, or he's asked to be much more, I don't know, big and loud than they're used to him being, and he's slightly less. I mean, commentators, it's their job to be somewhat hyperbolic and excitable, but this member was saying, no, don't worry, he's actually he's one of our favourites. So apparently he it's not only the riders who get portrayed oddly.
Melodrama award. All the French people.
I think just
in
all the
whole
French
show.
and Lefebvre, who's just all the French. Oh, Valentin Madouas had some very good. Well, he had made a great face, which unfortunately we can't pull as a quote. But and then there was he said on the bus when Stefan Kung had said something like, "I bet on Pogacar and I'm an idiot," and Madouas said something like, "There's no truth in cycling," obviously in French. But it was brilliant. It was I learned a lot about Madouas in this episode.
I liked that one. I also just like every time we got Matteo on the screen.
Oh gosh,
was just great. Just grumpy, melodramatic.
I get a feeling you're going to get a lot of that in the next episode.
I think
it's the next
there's
episode,
more
the
coming.
last episode. Yeah, there's definitely going to be some Madouas.
Our final and most important award every episode, the Jonathan Vaughters Understanding the Assignment Award. Richard Pluga?
Yeah.
My reasoning there is he understood multiple assignments. He understood the being evil assignment. He understood the messing with Matteo, which we get a little hint of at the very end, sort of like the preview of the next episode assignment. He understood multiple assignments. He got it.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's really what he should have wanted, but it's certainly it almost seemed intentional. Yeah.
Yeah, he did.
Which
I don't think he'll be
fussed
fussed about his portrayal.
I don't think he'll care at all.
No.
Yeah. All right. Thanks for listening, everybody. That was Unchained episode 6. Episode 7, we'll be back to chat about Kamikaze Mission.
Oh, gosh, yes.
Interesting name for a episode. We'll be back for Kamikaze Mission in a couple days. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We'll see you then.